Welcome to the Vintage Downhill Podcast. My name is Chuck Davis, your host. I'm here today with Jamie Lynn from Britain, Maximilian Montenegro from Transylvania, and Jeff Steber from Intense. Welcome and good morning. Thank you for joining today.
Hey, everyone. Jeff here from Intense Cycles.
So glad to have you, Jeff. This whole thing is pretty much all your fault. We started this Vintage Downhill group, I think, on November 27th, 2017. And it started out with a conversation between me and Max and another vintage bike group where we were going through the history of the M1 dating back to like 1995. And we just totally were geeking out. Like me and Max were getting down to like middle of the year, 1997, I think he changed the main pivot size. In 1996, the swing arm changed. We had like totally geeked out. I didn't even know who Max was. I just knew he knew M1s. And we had written this super long conversation detailing the history of the downhill bikes that you've been making. And we kept it within the rules and the boundaries of this vintage bike group, but the guys that ran the group didn't know downhill. And they thought every suspension bike must be new. And they deleted the whole thing. And Max and I were like so flabbergasted. We're like, okay, we got to do something ourselves because these old school cross country dudes don't know downhill. And that's why we started the Vintage Downhill group, was all because of the M1 and the history of the M1. And we wanted to be able to have a place that we could talk about history of downhill bikes. So been a long time coming, but so glad you're here.
Well, I'm honored and humbled by that. Obviously, you guys, I love your site. I'm inspired all the time that there's people that are so stoked on we have a rich heritage and very authentic beginnings here at Intense. And the M1 was a big part of that. And kind of the thing that really launched probably the Intense brand into the limelight, so to say. So as we were talking earlier, we could go on and on about where Intense started, where I came from, a lot of that. We do have a diverse product line, even from the early years. But if we keep the focus a little more maybe on the M1 and the progression of that bike and how it changed the face of downhill, there's some gregarious characters along the way that were intense riders. So there's an interesting story in that one, the legacy of the M1 itself, and then the progression of that. Up until this day when we just recently are launching the new M1. So, and that's kind of exciting in itself. And maybe we'll touch base a little bit on that in the end. And along the way, I have a lot of little tidbits to kind of show that I think the viewers will dig. I actually broke out the Slaughterhouse camo from this era. Even a little story on this. We used to play around with logos when we do t-shirts and things back in the day, especially with the race program. And you might recognize this logo.
That's an Egypt logo, right?
Yep. From
fuel company.
Ferrari racing and Formula One and different forms of MotoGP. And so we kind of stole the dragon and we added an extra 2 legs thinking that we might be changing it. But and this shirt was only worn in the pits and by the racers. And of course, a lot of people all of a sudden wanted this t-shirt when they saw it, this kind of kit at the time. And we never really produced or offered them. So it was kind of a coveted thing. You guys might not even, know about it or have one, but we were contacted by a representative, a lawyer from the firm, and said, you can't be using that. So it went away. We never actually sold them or anything. It was just kind of a fun thing that we did and to stir stuff up. And we've done a few of those over the years, especially, based around the race team.
So yeah, Jeff, I think focusing on your downhill bikes and downhill lineage, being that we're the Vintage Downhill page, is good. But, we all know and love the rest of your bikes as well. And I think your original, very early bikes were more cross-country oriented. Wasn't your very first bike basically like an amp?
So that's a good starting point. And I'm going to grab this frame here. This is a early.
Oh, wow.
Called the Spider.
Yeah.
And we'll back here a little bit so you can see this.
Yeah.
So this was circa 1991 to like 93.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the original shock on it. To your point, that era, this has a little bit later Fox Alps 5, I believe is what that is.
Mm-hmm.
You can see the massive size of the shaft here. There's no shaft stiction on that, by the way, and I'm joking.
Right.
But that said, the bike originally, I actually used a small shock absorber that was made by Amp Research. It was a tiny little coilover that used an emulsion. It was an emulsion shock with a shaft through design. Super simple, easy to rebuild, which you needed to do quite often because it was about as simple of a hydraulic damper system as you could imagine. Just a piston with a little O-ring and a orifice cut through it, you know, like a hole drilled. And then it had fluid on both sides and the shaft went through. So it actually worked quite well, worked okay when it was functioning. It was super light. That frame I just showed you, you know, that's like a 4-pound frame. So it's pretty light. And it was even a little lighter with that amp coil on it. And it was a horse link design. Another thing, like at the time, influenced very heavily by Horst Leitner. If you remember that era, and especially in Southern California, where I was operating out of, there was quite an ambitious cottage industry of small builders, custom parts. You know, you had in certain concentrations of Southern California, Santiago Canyon, this areas like that, you had Grafton, Ringley, Cook Brothers, you know, Intense. There was all these, Dave Turner was doing stuff. You had Amp Research, Richard Cunningham with Mantis. In fact, I would run into these guys all the time. And I would run into Richard Cunningham from Mantis a lot of times because we both started using the Nolene shocks, coil shocks that were made by, it was actually a motocross brand that made suspension and components. And they were making a custom mountain bike shock for us. And we would end up running into each other when we were picking up our shocks. And we usually did it when they were at the Yamaha test track, which was right near Corona, kind of halfway between where Richard was situated in Orange County and I was in the Lake Elsinore area. We would pick them up when they were at the test track testing with Nolene. We'd pick our shocks up, and that's how I got to know Richard Cunningham, and in those early years. So that was like early 90s, maybe up to 94, 95-ish or so.
Yeah,
so that's
I'll never forget the first time I saw one of your bikes. I was racing cross country at the Iron Angels race in Angels Camp, California in 1995. And I had an Amp Dagger, which back then was a pretty high-end bike. And I looked down to this dude to the left of me. And I mean, your CNC head tubes, your square stays with the machining on the stays themselves really stood out. And I'll never forget the first time I ever saw the Intense Spider. And that thing was just levels above. I mean, I had a pretty high-end bike, but your bikes were like levels above, even back in 1995.
Yeah, and the way the square tubing came about is there was a tubing supplier in SoCal that I could actually drive to, and they had stock of this tubing. It was a Chandler tubing that was formed in the US. And then I would do what I called external machine butting, and to save weight and just take machine out areas, that's those little pockets, just to reduce weight on the tubing. And it kind of stuck through the years. I see you grabbed an interesting early Taser frame there.
That's a Taser, second generation, I believe, and it's the
nice.
same tubing, I believe. So
yep, same tubing. I think you know, same era. A lot of us were getting our materials that we're building in the SoCal area from similar places. I think Richard and Dave might have used similar tubing. You know, maybe they were using the same sources.
Yeah, you're right. Dave Turner had square stays as well.
Yeah.
So, and how did you make the transition to monocoque from?
Well,
from
I'll tell you, and that's a good segue, because there was a point early on. The Spider was really designed as a trail bike, cross country. And if you remember, in the early 90s, there were people were starting to see some brands were experimenting with suspension bikes, and there were some really bad designs that were put out, maybe by some of the bigger brands that used elastomers and like brass bushings and things like that. And they gave full suspension bikes a bad name very quickly.
Yeah.
And then there were some good designs like the Mantis or the Turner, the Intense bikes that used in the AMP bikes that used a little better technology that kind of isolated the pedaling forces and things like that. You weren't getting, and they used hydraulic dampers, things like, a lot more advanced, like second or third generation designs already. So there was a little bit of an uphill battle initially. So early on, downhillers of that era were on hardtails with maybe 3 inches of travel up front. Maybe they were running if you remember, the Tioga disc or something like that, that might allow you to get a little more compliance out of your rear wheel or something. Sorry about that. So that said, I realized there was a need for a dedicated downhill bike. And if you remember, in those early years, early 90s, like extreme sports were the thing, X Games was happening. And the downhill aspect of mountain biking kind of stole the show because it was much more exciting and all. And in fact, little side story here, before Intense was Intense, it was actually Extreme. And the very first bike I built has Extreme on the down tube. Well, I quickly found out that was copyrighted over and over again. So when I was at my local trails and I'd be riding, and hikers or, this occasional other mountain biker would show up and they would see this full suspension bike, which was the Spider at the time. They would go, dude, that's Intense. What is it? Where can I get one? And so the name Intense just kind of naturally stuck at that point.
Yeah.
So that was the naming convention. But back to the era of like realizing that there was a need for a dedicated downhill bike. And so I started that journey. And the first thing was we were limited by fork travel, a few other things. At the time, air shocks were the thing, and it was hard to find good coils. There were a few options, but the companies were really reluctant to do longer, stroke lengths and different eye to eyes and things like that to get the increased travel. They weren't seeing that much business in the shorter, 1.5-inch stroke or whatever, the short 6.5-inch eye to eye lengths that were based around like XC trail bikes of that era. So it was a little tough, and I actually ended up having to go to some off-road shock manufacturers to get them to make some custom stuff. So there are some, Sean Palmer replica bikes or early prototypes that had Custer shocks and shocks made by Works Performance and different things that were one-offs, until eventually Fox actually made the first vanilla coil that you might know it as I think the RX. So anyway, kind of bouncing around a little bit, but there was that need to make the dedicated downhill bike, and that had the proper geometry, more travel, a more rigid suspension, or chassis, so to say, so that you could let the suspension do the work. A better, more compliant, maybe like linkage system, that sort of thing.
So is this bike behind Jamie, is this the first gen M1?
Yeah, so
and Sean Palmer had that with a Custer on it.
Yeah, so this is that very original, and it's based off of what you see back there. And it's still, this bike didn't have the horse link because I was thinking that it really needed the rigidity of the swing arm. And you'll see some other versions once we got Sean Palmer riding this thing where the swing arm was beefed up considerably and the bearings. This bike only weighs 5.5 pounds, by the way. This frame.
Wow. That's what astounded me when I first got that one.
Yeah, it's super light. So the story you asked earlier about the monocoque. So at the time, I was trying to improve my frames, and I wanted to save weight a little more. So I was looking into butted tubing. At that time, Easton was a premier bike tubing manufacturer and alloy tubing, and they were located in Van Nuys, California. So just a quick drive away. And I figured, well, I'll see if I can get some butted tubes. And then I'm also going to bring some drawings and see if they can shape some tubes the way I want them to create some unique structures, you know, increase the surface area at the head tube, things like that. And they weren't just conventional round tubes that they had offered at the time. And so when I went to them, they're going, wow, this is kind of cool. But, you know, again, you know, they were like, how many units are you going to produce? And, you know, how much quantity of these? And, you know, and who are you? Why would we invest into this? And I'm going, you know, so it didn't really work out. And I left a little discouraged. So I kind of reached into my, you know, mental database, so to say. And I've had history in the past in aerospace and in motorcycles, motorsports, different things. And, you know, one of the construction techniques, especially with chassis, has always been formed monocoque pieces that are welded together to form new tubular structures, so to say. So I came up with that idea, really kind of borrowing it from probably even more so airframe structures and stuff, race car chassis that, you know, before composites, there was a lot of this type of construction used to keep things light, stiff, and strong. So I went down that road, and it was kind of interesting because the fact that I kind of hit a dead end with Easton, it led me into this whole other area that I wasn't going to, you know, I couldn't accept failure on that. So it helped me, you know, kind of look outside the box. And at the same time, I wasn't a conventional frame builder, and in that era, I would say, you know, frame builders made pretty conventional triangle frames with round tubings and, you know, fillet brazed and different things. And there was some alloy, you know, manufacturers at the time that were interesting to me that were using big thin wall tubing and stuff. And so, you know, kind of putting it all together, I kind of came up with some of my own techniques. And even on the early Spider, you'll see that's probably one of the first frames in that era you'll see that used a lot of CNC machine parts. And very different construction techniques. Sealed cartridge bearings to remove stiction. You know, one of the first things I realized if I was going to make suspension bikes was that you need to eliminate as much stiction as possible. So, you know, that's kind of been a proven thing. And so immediately I was using sealed cartridge bearings when a lot of the bigger manufacturers were using sintered or like brass bushings and things. And the problem with bushings in some respects were that when you put torsional loads on them, there's so much surface area that they get binding and heat buildup and things like that cause wear and noise and, you know, a lot of things like that. And they wear out pretty quickly. So maybe the bike would initially be pretty stiff and firm, almost too much, where it actually added a little bit of false damping into the frame. And then it would break in, and there'd be a nice period where, you know, for a period of time where it works really well. And then it continues to wear and gets a little sloppy. Whereas with the cartridge bearings, it was a little more consistent, and especially if you used a high quality bearing at the time. And, you know, bearings are designed to spin at a high RPM, and we were only using them for a small section of movement. So they weren't really used in their designed application at the time, but they worked well. And especially for a downhill bike where you're trying to eliminate every bit of stiction and that sort of thing. So,
Jeff, in those early days, were you doing any of the welding?
Yeah, so I've always been, I'm more of an artist, craftsman, builder, designer than I am an engineer. I'm not a degreed engineer by any means, but I've always been curious enough and had the intellect to be able to look in a book, or when the internet came along, wow, it's like there's no excuses now, or employed degreed engineers were needed and necessary, that sort of thing. But so there is a lot of tribal knowledge over the years for sure, but I've always been a fabricator. So even though, at the helm of Intense, I still build all the prototype bikes myself. I'm back in the fab lab here at Intense. There's several prototypes on the jigs right now in different stages, and there always is. So I'm pretty prolific that way. And I've got my own technique for building and fabricating prototypes. And as you know, once upon a time, Intense did all of our own manufacturing here in this same facility here in Southern California. And at a high point, between all the models, we probably did about 5,000 frames a year.
Rick the Welder back in the day, right?
Yeah, Rick the Welder. We had quite a crew. At one point we had 6 full-time welders and 2 shifts going. On one of the more recent M designs, the M16, the alloy version of it actually had, if you laid out all the welds in one straight line, it was over 16 feet of welding.
Wow.
Yeah, if it was one big long bead.
A bit of welding.
So interesting. Yeah, and that was, because of those bikes even had more elaborate monocoque structures where the whole front triangle was generally a lot of times was monocoque pieces, one complete form or several pieces welded together.
Something interesting about you and Intense is you jumped right into full suspension and skipped past all the hardtail stuff back in the 90s, didn't you?
Yeah, I never built hardtails until later and even more recent. We just launched the new DJ frame, a little hardtail that's got really nice shape tubes and geometry and construction. But yeah, I mean, that was the future, what I saw, and it was a good time for Intense to establish itself as a leader in full suspension bikes. And we never, until the Taser DJ, we never really offered a hardtail at all.
Do you have a motocross background, or what drove you directly to full suspension?
Probably from, off-road motorcycles, that sort of thing, for sure. Yeah, riding motocross, and I've never been a real avid motocrosser, but I enjoyed it as a sport and enthusiast. And again, I tinkered a lot with my bikes and stuff,
Yeah,
I couldn't leave them alone. If I get into something, I always have to try and improve on it or make it better. It's like learn to play guitar and I'm already building my own guitar, what I mean, before I can even play it, kind of thing.
I guess one of the things that from these very early frames like the Spider or these early M1s, Jeff, is the introduction of the swing link. Was that around about 95 on those first model frames? Because certainly this first M1 that I've got.
This circles us back to the Palmer era. I'm pulling out another one of these little goodies here. To the Palmer era, where Sean initially, it goes back a little further. Being located in Southern California in Temecula, Lake Elsinore area specifically, this was kind of the heart. There's so many of the supercross riders of that era that lived within like a 20-mile radius of my shop. And there were test tracks for Yamaha, Honda, and Kawasaki just off the I-15, in the Corona area. These guys lived out here, trained year round. And there was a point where a lot of them reached out to me once they got to kind of know, and I knew them through acquaintances in motocross. And a lot of the guys started cross training on mountain bikes, and it was fun for them, and if you remember in the early 90s, all of a sudden fitness and conditioning was a big part in motocross. It's one of the most physically demanding sports there is, and that was kind of setting some of the riders apart, the guys that really got into the training and physical conditioning part of it. That said, some of those guys were actually really into BMX and things as kids. And Mike Metzger, who also lived in the area, and he's kind of, if you're not familiar, he's like the godfather of freestyle motocross, but he was also a real avid motocross racer. And he might be the guy, you know, at the Anaheim Supercross or whatever that would make it into the final, but he was like doing the big triple jumps and doing can-cans and things during the race. You know, he was more focused, and it was a bit of a show, but he made his fame. But he was also really, you know, into BMX and dirt jumping. And he was actually one of the first guys I sponsored in local downhill races. He brought in Randy Lawrence.
Made up of motocrosses, right? Sorry to interrupt you.
Say that again.
First team was made up of former motocrossers or actual motocrossers.
Yeah.
Mike Metz, Randy Lawrence, who was a mechanic for Jeremy McMath.
Sean Palmer
was also in.
So totally, that group were really motocross guys, and that's who brought Sean in. And at the time, Sean had a house in the Menifee area in the same neighborhood with all those guys, and he rode motocross, and he got really interested in the bikes, and I got him one of those earlier strut bikes, and he kind of really took off with it. And here's where it gets interesting. Those guys started doing local Fontana races, and at the time there were the God of Thunder downhills. We went to a bunch of those, and you know, he was kind of turning heads and just, you know, his style. At the same time, he was given a lot of design. Those guys were giving me a lot of design feedback. And granted, those early bikes were a strut bike. They didn't have the linkage yet. And, you know, and they were running air shocks. So a lot of the innovation came from real world racing and these guys saying, hey, we could do this better. Could you try this? And then I was adapting to it and making prototypes really quickly. And, you know, they were basically kind of proving them at the racetrack at the same time. But a lot of that early influence, to your point, these were motocross guys, actually. Heavily influenced. In fact, the first World Cups that Sean and Randy showed up to and the Norban Nationals, they showed up, we were riding in moto gear. And, you know, if you went to a World Cup of that era, the downhillers looked more like downhill skiers in skin suits, you know, and helmets with no visors and things like that. And it was a very different look. We showed up looking pretty SoCal and moto and running Fox gear that was just moto gear. And pretty quickly we realized, like, Sean goes like, man, these leathers are just too heavy and hot. And so I said, well, let's just make shorts. And we cut the legs off of them and cut the sleeves off the jerseys and poke vent holes in them. And at the time, our Fox rep, who was really Sean's rep, Todd Hicks, who was, I think he still might be at Fox, he realized, like, hey, we got something here. And he said, well, let's just do this at the factory. We'll have the girls cut them up and sew them and hem them and that sort of thing. And we'll try putting some mesh in here and there. And it really was the beginning of a true downhill kind of moto-inspired downhill kit, so to say. So in a lot of ways, you know, it took about a year or two of Sean showing up at some World Cups and turning some heads that pretty soon within a year, it changed kind of the whole face of downhill to where everyone was wearing moto-inspired gear, right?
This was about the time of Chain Smoke coming out.
Yes.
Which had Randy Lawrence, I believe Mike Metzger, Sean Palmer, obviously your bike with the helicopter. And it was just a punk rock, kind of rock star sort of feel to it. Whereas all the prior mountain bike movies, Tread, Retread, were like cross-country focused. Chain Smoke comes out and now suddenly we're kind of the ragtag rock stars of the mountain bike.
Yeah, I think it was being in the right place at the right time with the right people and the right bike, you know, kind of that magic combination in a pretty magical time in mountain biking. If, you know, we're lucky enough to be part of that. And it really was a transformation era in a big way. And a lot of the, you know, the bigger brands realized that there was a lot of focus on and excitement around downhill mountain biking versus the cross country platform at the time. And they had downhill teams, but they had they didn't have their downhill bikes developed yet. So pretty soon after Sean kind of, turned heads and made the scene, all of a sudden there was all these other riders from other teams, going, hey, if I can get, my manager to okay it, or the brand, could you give me some frames and I'll badge them, of our team, but I'll leave the Intense on the back. And sure enough, the story there. There was so many teams and riders that were on an M1 chassis all of a sudden. It was almost a little unfair to the Intense team riders, but there's a huge list of riders I've worked with over the years that have been on Intense throughout the eras, and frames that were, with different badging on them. It was all started with this, and I think that combination of, this character, the gregarious Sean Palmer, and the unique bike, and the look, even like you said at the time, that was very polarizing, and I would say the mid 90s through early 2000s was kind of an era of Intense, and that really put it kind of on the map and being kind of a specialist in full suspension frames. A pivotal time in my first trade show that I did, and this is going back the early 90s when I first started playing with the bikes with the Spider, but there was a point where it was just doing this part-time and in my garage at my house, and I decided, okay, I was building custom guitars at the time, I was doing finish carpentry and building these bikes, and I'm going, okay, I'm going to stick with one of these and make it a real thing. And at the time, there was the guitar thing was going off with custom guitars and Van Halen and all this, and so there seemed like a lot of competition there. And I was having a lot of fun with the bike thing because I love cycling. And it was like, okay, I got this suspension bike, and it seems like there's a lot of headroom there. It's like it's something kind of new. So I went that direction. And in 1993, I did my first trade show. It was the Interbike show. That year, it was at the Hilton Convention Center in Las Vegas. And I remember it well because I had a little 12 by 12 booth. And after I built all my frames for the show and built up 3 complete bikes with all the trick components, I had about $300 left in my bank account, and that had to last me through the weekend. My plan was I would sell off any of the samples I could at the show. And the first day of the show, my booth was kind of like a pretty happening and kind of swarmed with international distributors and like local dealers and stuff. And so at that show, I set up my first, bike shops and dealers. I set up my first international distributors, and I sold all my samples. And in reality, that was kind of the seed money to start Intense. And I went home, and I was full time after that. And, for the many years, some of the distributors I picked up, one in particular, my Japanese distributor, they remained our Japanese distributor for many, many years and were friends. And every year they would visit and stay with me and my wife, Jen. It was more than just a business relationship. There was friendships that involved. The first bike shop I set up was Cambria Outfitters. Oh, wow. And it was the original owner. And it was that really cool organic shop in Cambria, California, down by the beach, and that company has grown and evolved since, and they still sell our bikes. But I used to build frames for them and hand deliver them, and then ride with the guys in the hills around Hearst Castle and all that up there. It was pretty exciting times, but a one-man operation.
Who did that alien paint job on the M1 that I think landed at Cambria?
Yeah, so you guys are pretty well informed about some of this stuff, which is great.
My friend Rolf was the photographer that day.
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember what year that was. I think it was 95, maybe. And I would always, this is pre-internet, so you had to get the attention of the magazines and to get, and Intense was always one of those kind of camera magnets for the press and that sort of thing. And I always would do things specifically for these shows to kind of stand out. And so in that era, I'm a big sci-fi buff. So the Alien film series with, the sets and the alien design and all, H.R. Geiger, I was a big fan of that biomechanical kind of the whole esteem that went along with it. And I knew one of the painters at Troy Lee Designs, and I worked a deal with him to get him a bike. And he kind of did this in his spare time where he airbrushed the kind of the alien motif on the frame. And then the helmet was like the mouth of the alien. And we put that on display, and it got a lot of attention, just more of almost like a piece of art. And it was in that era of M1 frames. So there was a lot of surface area, and it even had like carbon wheels that were painted. So a lot of, it was really an art piece, first and foremost. And one of my dealers, it was actually Cambria Outfitters at the time. They would always bring some of their big clients to the show with them. And they had this one client that was a avid cyclist and, kind of a collector of bikes. And, I can't remember which sales guy it was, but he approached me and said, "Hey, Jeff, you want to sell that bike? I have a guy who wants to buy it." And I go, I'm really not interested in selling it. I think I'm going to hang on to it and hang it up in the shop or something. He goes, "Would you take $20,000 for it?" And this is in like 1995, I believe. Yeah. So I was like, okay, I didn't have to think about that one very long. And I said, okay, let's do it. And they actually handed me a check at the show, and for the show, they left with the bike. And that, again, this was seed money again, to take like another level of intense, buy a few more welders, that sort of thing. Maybe it's an old CNC machine or something from that era. So, and the bike actually was, the gentleman was like, I think he worked in finance or something like that, had a beautiful house on the beach, very modern, and he had it hanging on the wall as a piece of art. Something went awry with this, where there was some sort of white collar crime involved, where he was being investigated by the FBI. I think the Cambria guys got wind of it, and they were able to get in there before everything was like seized and confiscated in whatever transaction happened there, white collar crime of some sort. They got the whole bike back and the helmet. And to this day, as far as I understand, it's still in the shop there in Cambria, hanging on the wall. Yeah.
Nice.
What a story.
I've tried to get it back a few times. And, Clay Akey, who was one of the longtime owners and at Cambria there, was trying to barter with him, but he always goes back to, he wants the original Sean Palmer World Cup Stars and Stripes bike from the silver, the world's most famous silver medal bike from the 1996 Cannes World Championships. Yeah. He says, "I'll trade you that bike for the alien one." And I'm going, I just can't do it.
Yeah. Yeah, so your bikes have been ridden by almost everybody. I mean, John Tomac had a giant branded M1.
Brian Lopes,
the whole Mongoose team.
There's a
guys.
It's a crazy long list, and I forget, all the time. And this morning, knowing this podcast was coming up, I was trying to think of all the names, and I was telling my wife Jen, and she's going, "What about this guy and this guy? You forgot this person." I mean, it's crazy how many that have raced actually for Intense or Intense Factory Racing, but also the bikes that were rebranded. Eric Carter, Tomac, you mentioned, Scott Sharples, even G and Dan Atherton on Muddy Fox at one point, Nigel Page, Julian Camellini, Matti Lekikoinen. There's a massive list, besides the kind of more famous ones like Palmer and Michael Ronning and Kavarik and even in the more recent years. But the bikes that were rebranded, it was pretty interesting. Toby Henderson and that whole Iron Horse team.
Pistol Pete. Iron Horse.
Phil Tinsman. I can go on and on. I grabbed this bike because Eric Carter actually lives in the area, and he's, you know,
an interesting one.
I'm thinking this was his frame from that era when kind of Mongoose made a resurgence. And then also we used this same similar frame layout with Haro. Probably, which it, you know, is basically an M1 from the early 2000 era with a subframe up here. And even the Intense factory team ran that same configuration. But that same frame, and this is one of the more famous probably, is Greg Minar was on Haro team at the time that ran that frame set badged as a Haro, and that's when he won his first world championships, was on that frame. And to this day, Greg is a dear friend of Jen and myself, and you know, has always been like the guy is so solid, you know, if you've ever met him. So some of those relationships that were created from way back then were still, like, you know, they're friendships to this day.
I don't know if you saw, you know, on our little Facebook page, we have people from like almost every country. There's people like you and Maddie Leahy-Conan and Nicholas Villieu and Scott Sharples and all these people. And that's why we started up this podcast, is like, it'd be cool to talk to these people. But I don't know if you saw recently, Maddie rebuilt a yellow 1998 M1 and actually took it racing. Yeah, no, I mean, he's, you know, basically had retired or semi-retired from downhill racing, but yeah, I've followed some of his projects for sure, and it's really cool to see that. Definitely. I'm looking at my clock a little bit here too.
Yeah, believe it or not, Jeff, there was actually a shop in the UK probably about 6 months ago that I think 6 brand new Haro DHRs were pulled out of the storerooms. I managed to get one, so I've got a new old. But yeah,
and it is pretty cool. There's, like, even on your group here, there's a kind of an international, you know, group of guys here talking about cool bikes, right? So maybe it's a good time to segue into some of the evolution of the M1.
What's the real?
I have a few examples here. There was a point in 2003 where we had the opportunity to partner up as the sole licensee of the VPP suspension with Santa Cruz. And that was an opportunity to take an interesting suspension platform that was, you know, we were originally familiar with that from the Outland bikes, and kind of work together to improve the platform and the performance of it. And, you know, I think it was a long and successful relationship. Again, really solid guys over there and a group of people at Santa Cruz. They've kind of, it's kind of the dream scenario of a brand that had evolved and grown. And sometimes I'm actually a little jealous because I always envisioned Intense taking that kind of a trajectory, but for some reason it just hasn't materialized that direction. But hats off to them. They've achieved it and managed to keep their authenticity and that sort of thing, even in these recent years. But what a great working relationship with those guys, and still using, you know, versions of the original platform. It's been modified many times, but that era started with the M3 in 2003. And then there were subsequent M6, M9. I got a really cool bike here. You guys are going to drool over this, in a neon orange. This is a brand new bike with the gold anodizing of this era, a full-on M9 FRO. It has a Cane Creek double barrel shock in there. This was a production bike. I just managed to save this one somehow, and it kind of hangs in my office. But adjustable headset, head tube You know, they had the adjustable rotatable cups that went in there. Pretty cool. But this one's in pristine condition. It's never been built into a complete bike.
I got a phone call from Extra in the UK, Jeff, a few months ago, and they were clearing their warehouse, and they found a brand new dark blue one of those in a box marked up as an Uzi, and I was able to grab that. That's never been built either.
You notice I'm only showing you guys alloy bikes.
Love the alloy bikes.
Carbon ones too, but I think I'm going to keep it focused on the alloy bikes because talking vintage here. But this was the alloy version, which we produced in-house here. And that last bike I showed you also was produced here at the factory. But this was the M16. There was also a carbon version of this bike, which is a beautiful bike. And again, there were a lot of private teams and different sponsored teams that raced the M16 on the World Cup circuit through the, I would say, the mid 2000s. But this is another pristine, brand new. It's a satin black one.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. So, you know, after the M16, the next era would be the development of the M29. And, you know, I would say about the year 2009, I actually experimented with a 29-inch downhill bike a bit with the what was it? The
951 29er, right?
Yeah, it was based off of our 951 platform at the time, which was kind of more of our weekend warrior, lower cost kind of downhill bike. That bike, everyone loved it and the way it rode. It was a little bit ahead of its time because we didn't really have the right forks, the right tires, wheels to make it happen. And a lot of people were kind of pissed that we didn't bring it to the market. But the fact was the market wasn't ready for it. So there was never the right, like the tire selection. We would have had to have really put a lot of, you know, actually really pushed it and kind of created those products ourselves at the time. But there's still a couple of those frames around the shop here. But it kind of got the juices flowing for 29-inch wheels in downhill. Now there was a stepping stone, and that was 27.5 into downhill. And now you're kind of the you know, the bikes have settled on either full 2.9 or a mullet setup with a mixed wheel, which we call 279, obviously. And it's a little bit of a rider preference thing, I think, these days. But we did experiment with it, and that bike got quite a bit of attention and press, and, you know, had some racing success from some local racers that were test riders and that sort of thing. It's just that the market wasn't there yet. You know, 29ers in trail bikes and cross-country bikes were kind of in their infancy in that mid-2000 era. But, you know, being kind of a curious designer, mad scientist, I'm always trying things like that. You know, maybe it was pushing the envelope a little bit. And because we did our own manufacturing here, we were able to react quickly to stuff like that. I mean, I've got 2 containers out back of Intense just full of prototype bikes, you know, where we tried stuff. This and that.
But weren't you the first company to actually put out a 29er downhill bike on the market in 2018? Am I correct with this? Because crews were the first to race them at Lourdes in 2017, I believe. But you were the first guys to actually sell a 29er downhill bike. Is that correct?
It probably is true with the M29. In that era, the team, we were kind of making a resurgence of the race team, and that was Jack Moyer, Dean Lucas, Charlie Harrison, and we had Nick Nestoroff was our junior rider that evolved up from the Palmer project, like our junior development project that we had going at the time. Man, and that's another story, like such great stories to tell here. We're just running out of time. But yeah, that era, and that was when we developed the M29. That bike, at the time, the race team was we were racing on the M16, which was a full 27.5 bike. The team was being managed by Bernat Guardia, who was a 20-year veteran downhiller and had raced for Intense for years on the World Cup. But he had taken over that project as a management, and my wife, Jen Gabrielli, was kind of like the team, you know, worked side by side with him with media and that sort of thing, team support. But the team got a lot of, I think it turned a lot of heads because we did a lot of cool colorways and matched. We were sponsored by Troy Lee, and so we brought in a lot of the moto kits. So you might remember some
what
of
a fun team that was.
What's that?
What a fun team that was.
It was, you know, and it was a very family atmosphere. The guys all got along. They were mates. The bikes, you know, and we would do different kits and bike colors for every race. You know, I remember one was the neon yellow M29, and then the polka dot neon kit and the pink gloves and, you know, things like that. It was fun. And the guys were turning heads. You know, Jack had quite a bit of success on the M29 even before the bike went to carbon. And that year, I think the debut of the bike, one of the first debuts was at the Fort William World Cup. And it was pretty adverse conditions, I remember. And he took second place on the prototype bike. And it kind of, you know, opened the floodgates a little bit for that bike. We were really quick to get a carbon frame that year done. And he took a bronze medal at the World Championships in Cairns that year. That was Jack on the first carbon prototype of the M29. And then we go into the next era would be the Aaron Gwynn era, starting in 2019, which, you know, ran for 4 years. Let's see, yeah, basically. And there was an opportunity there to develop the next generation M bike. And I might have taken it a little too far because it took us quite a few years and a lot of prototypes. But we learned a lot. And the cool thing was I had the opportunity and the support from corporate, so to say, Intense, that we were going to take a learn-it-all approach to this and not a know-it-all approach. And I know I said that probably a few times.
I love that.
But it's true. Like, you know, hey, there was so much happening in downhill bike design, and, you know, the Europeans, there was you know, kind of a component where once upon a time, maybe in the early days of Intense, like the limelight was on downhill, focus was on North America. Like we were kind of leading the technology or whatever, maybe to some degree, or where the sport was going. But it was best, you know, in more recent years, it was definitely dominated by European influence. And so, and we kind of, you know, developing bikes and trying to grow a company, you know, it's like that was so downhill focused. At some point you have to shift your focus a little bit and build, design, and sell bikes that kind of pay the bills, right? So we might have lost a little focus at some points on the downhill projects, but the Aaron Gwynn era allowed us to do that. And so immediately when Aaron came on board, we were looking at, in fact, kind of pushing Aaron to try other designs that he may not have ever ridden before, high pivot bikes, you know, some of these different, and right away it kind of, the light bulbs were going off and there was an opportunity to try a lot of things. So there's probably 3 distinct bike prototypes that came out of that era that led up to the current, what we're just launching, will be, you know, a new production version of the M1 that we've seen recently. And over this season, especially, Dakota Norton having quite a bit of success with.
So Jeff, the resurgence of the horse link, if you're calling it that, coincided with your use of telemetry. And is this your first time using telemetry? And how have you been able to use that in the development of bikes?
Well, that's a good question because, yeah, prior to this program, we hadn't really incorporated, you know, data acquisition, I'm going to call it more so, to any degree other than maybe, someone or a rider doing it kind of almost on their own and sharing information. So the opportunity when Aaron came on board, who is very equipment oriented and technical and, good at tinkering and communicating, wants and needs. And then his mechanic, John Hall, longtime veteran, a personality in his own, we had accessibility to utilize John, and John was very interested in this and became a big part of that development program, which was the next generation intense downhill bike. So, kind of an interesting time, unfortunate in some ways too, because, the next year COVID hit and threw a big wrench in the whole system and kind of delayed things in many ways. And, there was some early on injuries that Aaron was struggling with here and there. We also had Nico Maloli on the program, who was obviously a great tester and part of the program, and was very instrumental in early on when we were testing these other bike platforms, where basically we purchased the top performing downhill bikes on the World Cup circuit and put it under, Nico and Aaron, and had them evaluate. And compared to what, at the time we were basically riding a version of the M29 that was a mullet wheeled bike. Not quite doing what we wanted it to do, and that bike never went into production. There was some improvements in geometry and the mixed wheel size, and the bike was performing good. It wasn't a hindrance in any way, but we felt like there was more performance to be gained. And really what we wanted to do was develop a bike where we could optimize and isolate all the individual suspension perimeters that were important to downhill. So we were focused on, we're designing a downhill bike here. So in, cross country or trail platform or enduro, it's like, I think as the travel grows and you're going against the clock and every one of these little like braking performance, pedal performance, leverage curve, shock tuning and all this, all of the complete package is so much more important. And the idea was to create a really well-balanced downhill race bike that could perform well on any variety of conditions. And so out of testing all those different bikes, we decided, I had two platforms we wanted to develop, and one was a 6-link bike, and one was a 4-bar, more conventional horse link style, but with a really nice linear leverage curve. And I wanted to do them simultaneously, but resources and time, at hand, we decided, well, let's do the 4-bar one first because we can get it done quicker. Well, it took a lot longer than we thought. We've been kind of experts at building bikes with unified rear triangles and dual links and things like that. So going back to a 4-bar design, you think would be kind of natural and easy, but the structures are different. The loads are different on the frames. A lot of these things, we didn't have the right tubing at times, stuff like that. So the bike, which got to be known as the HP4 for High Pivot 4, performed well, but it was almost a little bit of a one-trick pony. We went a little extreme maybe on the High Pivot, to where we would realize that it kind of made it more of, like point it through the rough stuff and just hang on kind of bike, plow bike, whatever you want to call it. But it suffered in a little bit in some other areas. I think if we kept refining it, it could have been a really good platform. The alloy bike was a little weird looking, and it was never intended to produce it. So it was more of a test platform. So it had a really long link that moved a lot to get a very linear, leverage curve. some things like that. If we had refined it and moved it into production, it probably would have ended up looking a lot like, I had sketches. It probably would have ended up looking a lot like the new GT Fury. They're very similar.
Yeah.
You know, with the length and the way the rocker and the amount of movement in the shock. The thing was, we still wanted a little, we wanted to really isolate the shock linkage so that it was easy to change progression from rider to rider, or coil to air shock. And so the 6-link bike allowed you to do that. And so that bike, I wouldn't call the design or the technology novel in any way. We did apply some things like the mid-high pivot, but we borrowed ideas from other products out there, bikes out there that worked really well. And the scissor link configuration, for example, really allowed you to isolate the shock tuning and the leverage curve. And it's very simple to just change the one link out, or have different mounting holes to change from progressive to linear shock curve, things like that. So it was very easy to tune that without affecting the other perimeters like that were important, like anti-rise, anti-squat, wheel path. And we also learned from the HB4 that bike was a little bit, like I said, the pivot was too high. So, you know, the change in like static versus dynamic geometry on bikes like that with really high pivots where the bike grows so much can be really drastic. And so there's negatives to that. And is just as much of rearward wheel movement you have to control. That wheel has to move back forward just as much. And right. So there's always this tuning, like some of the bikes that have the really high pivots are a little challenged because how do you set the rebound up? Because it's just going to slam back in at that high rate into the next, you know, sharp edged rock or whatever, you know, the bump force that it just released from. It's got to come back forward at just the same amount. So there was a kind of a happy medium, which a lot of the newer designs, I think, are settling on what we call kind of a mid-high pivot, but still uses an idler. On that new M1, you could run the bike without the idler and maybe use like a O-chain device and not really notice any pedal kickback, so to say, that would be, you know, detrimental in any way. I personally don't like the feel, and a lot of riders don't like maybe the O-chain, the feel of that, you know, and they are adjustable, but the pivot, the high pivot and the idler really manages the chain force as well. So that bike, we felt like we hit right off the bat when we did the first test camp about a year ago with the first, which we originally called HP6 for high pivot 6-link. The riders, like right after the first run, and they were doing back-to-back at Windrock, right near where Aaron has a house and Dak lives. They were like sold, like there's no turning back. So we just kept refining it. I've got one of those frames here somewhere. Where is that go? So we might have seen some from the US Open. There was a nice red one that was more of a production bike. This is a front triangle that I had on my desk with all the production tubing and everything. So it's a custom form tube set. Something interesting about this bike too, that's a big inherent part of the design was this, what we call the backbone. And this is really interesting because it is a big part of the design. That houses all the key structural points and mounting points for all the linkages, including the shock. So you can assemble the whole bike, linkage and shock and everything. It's all onto this part. And because originally it was produced as a one piece, everything remains in perfect concentricity because it's a machine part and you're not welding in little fasteners or barrels to mount links onto that can get deformed. And, you know, that's one of the challenges sometimes of working with aluminum is there's a lot of deformation that happens and you got to control that. heating and cooling and heat treating. Frames can twist and that sort of thing. So this also allowed me in my fab shop, because I have a really good fab shop here for making, small batches of prototypes, but not like production frames so much, like large quantities. So this construction technique also allows you for me to make a really straight frame real easily. Yeah.
So is that machine from a billet, Jeff?
So originally we were machining out of a solid piece of billet. Some of the early M1 prototypes, you can imagine a very wasteful and expensive part. And then, for a production bike that would be produced, we obviously would do this as two halves that are forged and machined, and then they keyway together. And that is welded and then goes into a frame jig as a sub part. But this part you're seeing here, and this is something really neat and exciting, and actually probably hearing about it first on your podcast, because it's interesting. I've teased this, but the media hasn't really picked up on it for some reason. I think they've been a little bit excited about the lugged, printed lugs and bonded carbon tube bikes that you're kind of seeing, which for me, I'm a welder, and while those construction techniques are interesting for prototyping, it just wasn't something that I do every day. I have a particular construction technique, and that involves welding. So we were approached by a German company. The name is Trumpf. That's with a F at the end. And if you're a machinist, you know of this company. They're like a premier manufacturer of milling machines, additive manufacturing, 3D printers, laser cutters, you name it. Some of the best machinery in the world. And they are some of the leaders in 3D printing and the machines to do that, state of the art for additive manufacturing processes. And there it recently was, we know that you can print titanium, you can print certain metals, but alloy has always been a challenge to where they could get the density and the porosity correct through the 3D printing process until just recently, and this is very recent. There's a company, Elementum, that came out with a 6061 material that, when printed through the correct process, has the same material properties as billet or forged 6061 material, and you can weld it and heat treat it, and it retains its structural integrity. And so when we heard this was like an opportunity, and we did a little collab with Trumpf, as they're looking for more and more industries to move their technology into. Obviously aerospace, automotive, are always the first, military, but they happen to have a crew of avid cyclists in their development team and in group of engineers that were able to convince them, let's look at the bike market. And so this project, this is actually a 3D printed backbone that they actually printed 2 of these at once on the machine. It takes, probably about 20 hours to print 2 of them. But if you look at the time and man hours it would take and tooling to machine this, for example, and even in the forging process, but to do it as a one piece, it's a beautiful part. You can even see the Intense logo is machined or printed in there.
Wow.
So this frame is one of the first ones welded with the one piece 3D printed backbone. And it welds just like billet aluminum, heat treats, the structural properties. You can't tell the difference. I can't tell the difference. So it's kind of interesting in that fact that, for prototyping and for us, this is actually a better because you could print a part, like any part on the bike. The next step is we're going to print the whole bike, basically, and weld the pieces together, or actually not weld and print with this new material. But it gives you another opportunity to completely look at structures differently. And it's just a different approach. Can I see this process moving into production? Definitely can. We look back at the first flat screen TVs we saw, they were super expensive and heavy and bulky. And now they're basically, you don't even repair them. You just throw them away when it breaks, I mean, they're so as technology goes, I think this definitely will be a future of manufacturing for this. But I'm currently using it more as a prototyping process. And because it works better with more conventional form of frame fabrication that I'm familiar with. And, with race frames especially, there's a lot of little things that happen, like the development of the M1 frame, the racers, and we had 4 guys riding prototype bikes. So in the field, as we're developing the bike, we were lucky. I think the bike, we engineered it well enough that there were no major structural failures or tube failures, but you do see lots of fatigue issues, like small cracks around welds and things that probably would never propagate into something that would be a problem. But if that were a production bike, for example, that's a warranty, and you don't want to chance it with racers. But those sort of things can be repaired on an alloy frame very easily. So we would rotate frames, we'd get fresh frame, get that frame back, repair it, maybe learn something from it that we change on the production modeling and add, a bigger radius or more material, and that sort of thing to the bike. We did also a lot of 3D printing on this bike early on with plastics to just validate the structure. Mm-hmm. So you can see here how the backbone kind of works and is the main support for all the suspension pieces. It's very easy to tune this bike. The leverage curve with this link right here, part of the scissor link, can be changed out very easily. The way we designed the bearings, we use a bearing that has an extended inner race, so you don't need lots of little washers and things as spacers. It eliminates a lot of that. So a lot of feedback from the team mechanics that we integrated into the bike so that it's easy to work on, external cables. It's a race bike, so, all the cables are external, easy to change if you got to quickly change out a brake or something. The linkages are easy to change, even though there's, a lot of them, so to say. But big pivots, that sort of thing. The right bearings based off of the loads that are applied to them. So we did a lot of that kind of research too.
I love that you're keeping the brake cables external, Jeff. I know it's a bit of a fad to run things internally, but it's such a pain.
Yeah, and that was, again, having someone like John Hall on the project and then the rest of the mechanics, working on these bikes all season, that was probably one of the #1 things. Just keep it simple, and it makes a big difference. We did scallop the underside of the top tube a little bit to kind of hide it, but other than that, they're external and it's a quick change.
Frank the welder was commenting on Nico's bike recently and had a similar comment. People that actually have to work on bikes, they like the brake cables run externally. And I love that you're keeping up with all the manufacturing technology, the 3D printing, additive manufacturing technology. I can tell you're really excited about it.
I think you have to these days. There's it's just amazing. Always been a big NASA fan, and when I was a kid, I was a total space geek, and built little models of the Apollo, the whole, I had so into it. When the space program went consumer, went public, and you have these big corporations and tech companies, launching rockets into space and stuff. Because I remember back from NASA and the space programs, all the technology that trickled down into the consumer sectors eventually that was developed to send men into space. And especially now with the future of e-mobility, you know, e-bikes, all that, and you know, you don't do anything in space without batteries and solar and, you know, this and that, and the materials that are used, that technology now it's skipping a lot of bureaucracy and going right into the consumer channels through these companies that are, I mean, they have to be doing it because it's a part of it is they're developing technologies for the future, especially the next generation of batteries. Whether you know, it's graphene, digital, solid state battery, whatever you want to call it, they are already working and using technology that'll eventually, you know, change the face of e-mobility in the future. That's just one example.
Yeah. Yeah, people forget the cordless drill, I believe, was invented by NASA so they could use it in the spacecraft, right?
Yeah, there's so much great technology. And, you know, like I said, we're kind of skipping some of the bureaucracy by going into the community, you know, these commercial segments, going public with it more, for sure.
Jeff, we're almost coming up on time, but what do you want to, or what can you tell us about the release of the upcoming M1? Is it going to be made in aluminum? Are those,
yeah, so we did a
adjustable?
Yeah, we did a soft launch at the US Open and had a good showing there. And I think, unfortunately, Aaron was injured this whole season, starting for first World Cup. But Dak and Joe and even Seth had some really good results, especially Dak really put the bike in the limelight. And you know, he has a unique aggressive riding style that he really tailored the bike, you know, to work for him well, and he rode it for its strengths. And I think the combination, again, I always saw Dak as really one of these kind of, you know, he's an intense rider. He has that grit and that kind of rawness that, you know, Palmer and Kavarik had in certain ways. And
we're so close,
it emulates in his riding style and how he sets up his bike very uniquely, and the lines he takes, everything, his personality.
Can I ask a team-related question? Because I'm a huge team rumors kind of guy, and I always follow the Vital Forum in this respect. Will the guys be back for next year?
Well, it's been, I'm thinking it was 4 years with the Aaron program. And really, at the time, the Intense owned and run Intense Factory Racing program, IFR, kind of went away. And we decided we worked a program with Aaron where we kind of contracted him to run the team. So in reality, it's his program. And we're the title sponsor of it, obviously, and we carry the main badge. At the same time, it was a developmental program, not just for Intense, but, you know, for a lot of other brands, E13, V Tire, you know, there's quite a few others in there, you know, from Aaron's side. That said, I think the idea at the time was we were at a pivotal point in growing Intense, and we needed to keep our focus on kind of eyes on the prize in that respect, that we thought we would try a different program where we farmed it out kind of, and Aaron ran that basically. So currently the contract is up for renegotiation. I'm not going to really say anything yet, but there is a strong focus at Intense now to take the program back in-house. And we really want to develop also the next generation. There's a strong contingent of really talented young racers, North American-based racers, for example. And you might see us doing a little bit more of a junior program even. Maybe along with some other options out there. But I can definitely say that we really believe in the future of US downhilling and want to support that. And there's strong series in the US and good tracks being developed. And the work that like Nico and Aaron and Dak have done back east with some of the is like is quite an accomplishment. And so we might shift our ideas for a little while on how we approach
just putting this out there, Jeff. I am available for next season. I haven't signed with anyone just yet.
Would you race that vintage M1 in the background there? Maybe we go.
I spent too much on that and spent too long getting it from the middle of the Arizona desert to dust that one up. But I'll take a new one in the same colorway.
Yeah, I probably have a few of those old ones laying around here that are, as you saw, that are in race condition. But anyway, so that's about all I can say at the moment. You know, probably there'll be announcements January 1st or something. But we're not, there's no way Intense would ever get out of racing. We shifted our team goals multiple times. We have a really, the M1 is definitely a proven bike. It's World Cup caliber. It's a bike that that can win World Cups. I think it's a really well-rounded bike and easy for anyone to hop on and go fast, and probably you know, will help them become a better, more confident rider in a variety of conditions. That said, we did do the kind of a soft launch of it. You might have saw the red alloy one, and it is on its way to being produced as an alloy bike initially. I'm not saying if there'll be the carbon one eventually or not. If there is, it probably will be even a little bit of an evolution of the current alloy bike, but the alloy bike is definitely happening, and it'll probably hit the market early spring in time for downhill season, and probably in 2 colorways, the Intense Red and then a raw option. So kind of going back to our roots a little bit.
Cool.
In that respect, we also just launched our little DJ bike that is a pretty fun little bike, and kind of again working on some of the stuff that put us on the map in the first place and getting that mojo back a little bit. You know,
is that US made, Jeff, or is that Far East made? That one?
They're not. They're made in Asia at this point. We currently don't have a facility in the US, although it's been discussed to do small special batches of like premium FRO bikes or something out of the facility here. I keep toying with that, especially with this 3D alloy weldable material prospects, you know, playing with that. It might be a reality. Alloy is not an easy material to work with, and you know, and to do right. And I can say, you know, the early years of Intense and being a manufacturer, you know, probably put out some crooked frames, and there's some people that really have hung on to that they got a frame that wasn't perfectly aligned or something. And you know, the sins of the past, moving forward, I've tried to learn from that, for sure. And in recent years, Intense probably puts more effort, I'm really proud of this, into customer service, and our customer service team, and having warranty parts available nationwide. I mean, once upon a time, Intense was very much like early years of Ferrari or Porsche. You know, if you didn't live in Italy or Stuttgart and you were in the US and a Porsche fan and you needed parts, it was, you know, it was a passion brand, and you could overlook that a little bit for a while. But, you know, obviously both those companies have come a long way in that aspect also. But it's really important, and it's probably one of the things I'm most proud of with Intense these days is our attention to customer service, warranty parts on hand, that sort of thing. Every part, you know, we try to keep going back 7 years. You can get any link or bolt or shoulder bolt or whatever for any of the frames, is readily available. It's all blister packed. It looks real professional. When people visit the factory, I always kind of show them that first, because it was one of those things that, you know, I heard it really pained me to hear that from any customer or fan of Intense, that there were guys that, had a sour taste in their mouth because they got a crooked intense frame or something. And it wasn't the rule, but occasionally that would happen. It's hard to make really good aluminum frames. And they're, even in the field, aluminum has its constraints as far as fatigue strength and reliability and things like that. And when you're trying to make lightweight, tip of the spear racing alloy bikes, they're probably going to crack at some point, and if you want to make them reliable, that pass the test of time, and they're going to be heavy.
Jeff, so, I want to say something about some sweet taste in the mouth, and it's a story that I shared with the guys before. I have actually met you in person in Val di Sole in 2016 on the World Championships, and I just recently acquired that year the bike that I was showing you when you were showing us that frame. It's this M9.
Oh yes,
in neon yellow, and the whole craze back then was to make 26-inch bikes into 27.5 bikes, and I was not sure if that is possible. And I always believed that you guys had an M9 Evolution version. So back then you were working with the suspension center team. So I contacted two of the riders via Pink Bike, and I asked them about this, and they said no, we just put the G3 in the long setting and just ran an angle set, and I had that information ready already. So I met you on the World Championships, and I dared approach you, and I asked you about this, and you were very cool about it, and you said, hey, that's what we did with the team. Just go with it, have fun. It'll be a very fun bike, and that's actually what I did. And it's still my favorite downhill bike out there from all my bikes, and it's probably more fun than my 29er, which I race currently. But I respect your approach quite a bit, and I want to thank you for that, because it gave me the necessary validation to do something that I wanted to do, and it was way easier to do it with your approval.
That's great. Well, I always try to be accessible when I'm out there and talk to people that are fans of the brand and all of that. And again, really flattered to be on this forum and talking about the rich heritage and authenticity of Intense. That said, that bike, it was easy to do because there was so much adjustability, and with the adjustable dropouts and things of that era, that you could do things like that. It was also scary at times because occasionally we would see a bike, we used to call these like monster bikes, that someone would configure the links and everything into some weird configuration, and we're going, I probably shouldn't be running it like that. That's not a good idea, but it's like, yeah. So.
Well, Jeff, you've been very generous with your time, and this has been great catching up with you and talking about the history of you, your company, downhill bikes, specifically the M1. We're all very excited to see the release of the upcoming new M1. And you can tell we're all fans of Intense. We all own and ride your bikes today. So we really appreciate your joining us. Your joining and participating in the group online has been awesome, and we're open to having you back on. When you have updates for us, we'd love to have you back on if you're game for it. So I wanted
to give us a year or so, and we'll talk about the future and kind of leave the past behind us a little bit.
Maybe we'll do something at the shop.
There you go. That would be great. Maybe I do like a head cam or something, and we go through the shop, and that would be a real treasure chest of there's Jeff, a lot of memorabilia throughout the shop. Kind of like you guys, all three of you, your office or whatever. I'm looking in the background there and seeing some gems for sure. And again, appreciate in all three of you your enthusiasm for the brand and just for downhilling and mountain biking in general, and kind of telling the story of the new generation of riders and just generations in general that are like flavor of the week, of the moment, instant gratification. They don't embrace a lot of the history that's so entertaining and interesting and got us to where we are now. So it needs We need people like you guys.
Well, we're glad you're part of it, and we're glad that you're here. This has been awesome and great catching up.
Thank you very much.
All right, gentlemen, we'll call that a wrap. Thank you so much. We'll talk soon.
Cheers.
Bye.